Good evening and welcome to the April 2nd, 2020 Gilderland Central School District Board of Education meeting. Would you all silence your cell phones, please, and do the pledge?
Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So we have one item on the agenda tonight, and that is the budget workshop. So I'll let Dr. Wiles take over.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. I know that we're here tonight to talk a little bit about the budget for 2020 and 2021. But before we jump into that, I'm wanting to say a few words to our greater school community, because while this is in some ways business as usual to do a budget workshop, this is not at all business as usual. And so I know all of our faculty, our staff, our families are, first of all, I'm hoping they're taking good care of themselves and each other. And I just want to recognize how hard I know everyone is working. Every mom, every dad, every teacher, every student, everybody is working hard because we're in a place where there is no path. We are making the path, and every last one of us is in learning mode. And so I'm just so appreciative of everyone's efforts and their patience and their willingness to, stick with us, and we'll get through this together. But I just couldn't not take this opportunity to tell people I'm really thinking of everybody and hoping everyone is well, and let's stick together and get through this. So, so we are here at a budget workshop. And we have a couple things for the board and the community tonight. We have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm shortly going to switch to as a demonstration of my own learning, to go from camera to share my screen. We'll see how my learning and practice earlier today pans out. So we're going to start tonight with a relatively brief presentation that Mr. Sanders and I will do. And then we're going to open it up for questions. You also have, board members, a worksheet that we sent along in the portal earlier today that summarizes this many slides into a single page that you can use for further discussion. And the last thing I'll say before I switch over to the presentation is that this is still a work in progress. There's lots of moving parts still. So this is an opportunity to get some feedback. We have a little bit of extra time this year before we adopt the budget. We had planned to do it this coming Tuesday, and that will not happen. So we have a little bit of time. So I'm going to switch over to our PowerPoint presentation here. If you can just give me a moment. And I'm just really proud of myself for accomplishing that. Can you all see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay, before we go on, I just got a message from Andy Maycock. Since Neil and I are going to be doing some talking, if everyone could mute their mic during this time, it will help with the sound quality for our viewers. Okay? So Neil is going to actually get us started, and I'm going to be operating the advancing of the slides. So Neil, I'm going to ask you to just give me the cue when you're ready for me to go. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Marie. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're going to be presenting the budget workshop. This is something that we do annually with the board, so they have an opportunity to see what other adjustments we've made to the budget since the superintendent released the draft budget document on March 10th. So we'll start by walking through a little bit of that. It's been a few weeks. And just to remind everybody where we left off, and then we have some additional adjustments that we've made to the budget in the meantime. So first, we'll start with that recap. If you could advance. There we go. So our projected budget for the year on March 10th, superintendent's draft budget document, $103,534,000. And that was a 1.4% increase on the budget and an estimated tax impact of 2.24%. Our budget increase was roughly 1.4 million at that point. In terms of the overall tax levy, we were close to our maximum allowable tax levy of $74,990,995. We were just shy of $6,000 under that. That resulted in a tax levy percentage increase of 2.24%. So we were very close to the margin of our maximum allowable tax levy of 2.25%. And that budget, as it was presented, would have passed with a 50% majority. We were not seeking a super majority of 60% at that time. In terms of the difficulty with that particular budget, we did have to make some expenditure reductions, and we did have to utilize a few more reserves than we normally would have, given the nature of the budget, limited state aid, and we'll be talking more about that in a little while. That did cause us to go back and have to make some reductions. You can see from the information we're providing, we had staffing reductions total of 5.7 FTEs, cost of about $373,000 for those. We have other reductions in other categories of about $253,000, things like travel, conferences, utility costs, bus fuel, contract transportation, and instructional hardware. And then in terms of our revenues, we did apply more of our savings in terms of fund balance and reserves in order to balance the budget. So even though we had reductions on the expenditure side, we still needed to bolster our revenue side in order to balance the budget. And that total between those two items was about $1.1 million in order to make that happen. So it was a difficult budget year that we have so far. And now Marie will talk a little bit about recommendations for 2020, 2021.
Thanks, Neil. So what's going to follow here are some recommendations that we've made since March 10th, given sort of our unprecedented circumstances. And I just want to preface all of this by, framing the why we're back at the budget development process with additional reductions. What I'm going to share with you going forward here is a series of difficult choices, but we're always in that mode of trying to strike a balance between the mission we're trying to accomplish and the resources that we have available to us. So we work from the premise that we're always going to start with student needs first. We always have to think about over the long run. This is never just a year-to-year enterprise by any stretch. And in the work that we're going to share here, I just want to emphasize that our goal was to preserve programming as much as we possibly can, so that when our students return in the fall, they'll have all the opportunities next year that we offered this year. So that was some of our thinking behind it. But there is a big shadow right now. We are working through a time of just unprecedented uncertainty that's touched every part of all of our lives because of this horrible pandemic, which has, done the unthinkable really, and it created the extended closure of our school buildings, but all school buildings in New York State. So as a result, I think we can expect a period of, I said potentially significant, but I think I was optimistic, but some truly significant economic instability that we just don't know how will play out. But we feel that at this point, we need to respond and prepare for our children's future, which is why you'll see these additional reductions. And I'll just reiterate that, there still is work to be done before we have a final budget adapted to go before the voters, however that might happen, and whenever that might happen. And I just want to reiterate that community input is welcome, and I'll talk about the how that will happen, a little bit later on in the presentation. But I'm going to transition now to talk about some of these additional recommendations that we're making. The first is a difficult one. We were looking at how we could find some significant savings. And one of the ways to do that was to look at our class size guidelines at the elementary level. And what we have proposed is raising them by 1 student, so that in grades K through 2, we would go from 18 to 24. The limit was 23. And in grades 3 through 5, the upper guideline would be 26. It had been 25. So based on those revised guidelines, next year there would be a total of 8 fewer elementary sections planned for next year. In the budget we presented on March 10th, that number was 5. Going forward, we're continuing to recommend that we have 3 unassigned teacher positions in the budget. In past years, we've had as many as 5, but again, looking to pare back a little bit, 3 are included so far. So this is the similar chart, similar to the one I shared back on March 10th, sorry. And the squares that have green shading are those sections that are affected by these changed guidelines. So you see there's 1 section at Guilderland Elementary School, and there are in fact 2 sections at Pine Bush Elementary School that would be affected by this reduction of 3 FTEs or 3 classroom sections. And I also wanted to share over in the far right, the overall class size averages across the district. And you can see that K and 5 are altered just slightly from where they were back on the 10th of March. The asterisks, I'll point out, are what we call bubble sections. Those are sections that are at or almost at the top of the guideline. So here's the financial impact of that. So with the reduction of 3 FTEs for classroom sections, that's a savings of $246,000. And I just want to point out that under the original March 10th proposal, 6 sections were at or near the upper guideline, and under this new proposal, 7 sections are at or near the upper guideline. And then along with that, when we reduce classroom sections, it also has an impact on special area sections. So when we reduce those 3 classroom sections, we also have a reduction in art at 0.2, music 0.3, and physical education at 0.2 for a total savings of $57,400. So I'm going to forge ahead because I can't see anyone's reaction to any of these, and we'll take all the questions at the end if that's okay. So I'm moving on to Farnsworth Middle School, and I'm happy to say that this is actually in a restoration from what we presented on March 10th. At that time, we had reduced a math AIS position at Farnsworth by 0.5 in order to meet a need at the high school. After our presentation and in consultation with our instructional administrators of math at both the middle and the high school, and with the building principals of those buildings, we came to the conclusion that that was not a good recommendation, that in fact, by reducing that position by 0.5 would eliminate essential programming for students. So it is restored here. And in the next slide, since we still had to make up that savings, this is how we have done it. And this all affects the middle school. So rather than reduce the middle school by 0.5 in math, we looked at reduction of special area classes for a total of 0.4 or $32,800. And you can see it's small pieces of, it's a section of art, a section of family and consumer science, a section of PE, a section of health, a section of general music, and a section of technology. And the impact of this, as you'll see under the rationale, will increase class sizes in those special area sections, but increased to what they are in the core area classes. So for example, in ELA, math, science, and social studies. The reason we would like to have an extra section for these subject areas is because this is hands-on learning, and that's sometimes more challenging with larger class sizes. You know, think about students learning to sew or cook, or in the tech lab. So that is a bit of a trade-off. It will mean class sizes go up by 1 or 2. But the upside of this is that no programming would be eliminated for students. Again, this is under the auspices of difficult choices and trying to balance needs. A few other implications for Farnsworth Middle School. One of the recommendations that came forward from the middle school for some savings was the elimination of the club advisors for ski and snowboard club. We have funded those advisors intermittently over the years, really depending on our financial condition. In the past, they've been funded through fundraising. They could be funded through the cost that families pay to participate in ski and snowboard club, but it is a savings of $7,752 if they are not district funded. The next item here is Strive for Success program. This is an after-school program intended to support at-risk students and their families. And the reality is the program struggled to recruit students and families to participate, and those that were recruited often didn't stick with it. So the middle school is comfortable looking at existing resources to do some different kinds of approaches to support at-risk learners. And then the last one here for Farnsworth is a 0.2 reduction for Spanish. And this would affect our 8th grade Spanish learners next year. And it too would be resulting in slightly higher class sizes for Spanish 8. And by slightly higher, I mean 1 or 2 children per section. At Guilderland High School, this again is a restoration. We had originally recommended reducing a teaching assistant in math science. And you might recall at the last board meeting, we got a question that said, could you restore that if you reduce the number of unassigned TAs in the budget, because aren't they hard to fill and go unused? So since that time, I went back and looked. We in fact only used 2 of the 5 unassigned teaching assistant positions this current year. So we've done that offset. So we'll have the teaching assistant back to support math and science at the high school, but we'll only have 4 unassigned teaching assistants in next year's budget. And I note their TA positions are really difficult to fill. We struggled with that and likely will continue to struggle with that. The next group are district-wide reductions. The first one is musical instrument replacement. This is not an elimination of that budget line, but a reduction. It would leave the $10,000 of reduction would leave about $18,000 to replace large musical instruments that are at the end of their lifetime. The next is the elimination of 3 assistant coaches, the JV girls and boys lacrosse, and the assistant coach in gymnastics. It's just a point, we have been unable to fill the girls lacrosse position. And then for the gymnastics, there's only 4 teams, school districts with teams remaining in the section. And we're wondering, what's the long-term future for those teams as things get more difficult. But the reality is that losing those positions does have instructional and supervisory impact. A tough trade-off. Going on, we are also going to eliminate a position of a maintenance helper. We've been trying to fill this position for many, many months. We have been unable to do it and have been able to manage. So Mr. Nooney has come forward to say this would be a doable reduction going into the next school year, and it's a savings of $67,300. And then we also looked at equipment repair across the district. Not unlike we did with travel, we pooled all of those resources and took a portion of it. It will mean that we delay some equipment repair. We are being mindful of those areas where repairs need to be done. So for equipment in the nurse's office, for example, that would go forward. Bob Winans has pointed out to us that with fewer resources to buy new instruments, we certainly need to have our repair line available to him in order to do that. So we will be mindful about where those reductions occur, so we're not putting anything or anyone in jeopardy. And then this last one is also some rethinking from our proposal back on March 10th. As I explained then, we are required under Ed Law 2D to do a number of data privacy related activities that are now required under the law. We've gone back to look at that a little bit more, and rather than include a half-time FTE, we're going to rethink that and look at a stipend and use someone from our existing staff in order to do that work. We're still exploring and fine-tuning exactly what that would look like, but we think that would be a good savings from our proposed budget on March 10th. You can see it's $35,000. And then the last thing I want to mention, I brought this up at our last board meeting, and I'll start by saying that it's a long shot, but I want to mention it anyway because perhaps all things are on the table. But for months we've been working on our school start times. A few of you are on our committee and know that we've done quite a bit of work, particularly around the transportation side of that discussion. It seems that, no pun, but all roads lead to transportation in this project. And we had enlisted the assistance of school bus consultants to help us sort through what our transportation routes would look like if we were to make some modifications to our school start time, and the analysis of that feasibility is underway. It could impact 2020, 2021. The proposal that school bus consultants gave us suggested that there could be as many as a need for 5 fewer runs. I spoke with Danielle Poirier about this today. We're not convinced it's 5 yet, but we're continuing to do some analysis and should have more of an update in the next couple weeks. We have a conference call with the school bus consultants next week to walk through that again. But by way of reminder, this is the chart we shared in the February newsletter that went out to our entire school community, all of Guilderland, all of our residents. And I put it in here just as a reminder that the plan looked at having the high school start at 8:15, so about 45 minutes later than current, and having one of our elementary buildings have that same start time. The other 4 elementary buildings would start just 5 minutes earlier than they currently do. And the idea there is to save on the volume of number of buses that are on the road all at one time. During our elementary runs, that is a high peak time, and this spreads out the distribution of buses across the runs. And then finally, you can see the middle school would start 15 minutes later at 9 o'clock. This is still proposed. It's what the consultants think that we can do on paper. We're still looking, as you've heard me say many times, if it works on Western Ave and that we can actually get all of our children to their buildings on time, because that's the priority. So, Neil, I'm going to hand it back to you. Neil?
Sorry, forgot to unmute.
Okay.
So thank you, Marie. In addition to the expenditure changes that Marie went through, we do have some revenue changes that we want to share with you as well. The first starts with foundation aid, and the next category is expense-driven aids. We have a settled state budget at this point, an adopted state budget. We've had that for 24 or 36 hours, so we've had a chance to try to look through that and glean what we can from that to know where we stand going into next year. Big factor, of course, is foundation aid, and that's that basic aid that follows every child in New York State. We had anticipated a small increase of $77,649 based on the executive budget proposal. What we're finding now when we look at the state aid runs, we will not be receiving any increase in foundation aid. So we are reversing that additional revenue that we had in the draft budget, and it's going back to the prior amount. So there will be no increase in foundation aid as we understand it at this point. In terms of our expenditure-driven aids, again, we have information from the state aid runs in regard to that. What we projected for next year and now what we're looking at in terms of the state aid run, we're short about $68,500 in terms of that revenue source. So we're making an adjustment for that in that amount as well. In terms of the other sources of revenue we have basically savings, which we've applied to the budget over time. One of the adjustments in the superintendent's budget was to use more savings than we've had up to this point, an additional $150,500 to help balance out the budget and reduce some of the reductions that we otherwise would have had to make to have a balanced budget. With some of the additional reductions that Dr. Wiles just talked about, we are trying to save more of our savings. And so what we're able to do is accomplish that, and we will not be using an additional $150,500 that we plan to use from savings to help balance the budget. In addition to that, with the additional reductions that were previously mentioned, we also are able to use less of our savings in the form of what's called appropriated fund balance. So again, having more savings on hand is going to help us. We have a great deal of uncertainty right now. We have a great deal of uncertainty for the future, and we want to try to keep as much in our savings as we can. And this provides an opportunity to do that going into what could be several years of difficult financial times. Also wanted to review the net staffing changes. This is cumulative, so this is based on what was presented with the superintendent's budget presentation on March 10th and those additional items that Dr. Wiles went through. So you can see we have categories of employees on the left-hand side. We have our schools and district-wide category across the right. So you can see for each of the categories where the reductions are going to occur in staffing, or if there is no increases, so it's all reductions. As was mentioned, at the elementary this year, that's in terms of sections. We are seeing a reduction in sections. That's the bulk of the teacher category there. In terms of some of the other categories, we have a reduction in clerical, we have a reduction in maintenance that was just described. On the teacher line, district-wide is an occupational therapist. At the high school, we have numerous changes, but one being a reduction in a high school counselor as well. So variety of changes. All of these staffing changes amount to just over a total of 13 positions in terms of reductions. So looking again at what our budget amount would be, so starting with last year's budget or current year's budget, 2019-20, we're a little over 102 million. Budget increase as proposed with the changes that we discussed this evening is another $964,000. That brings our total budget up to 103,071,313. That budget to budget increase is less than 1%, it's 0.94%. Our estimated tax impact is 2.25%. And again, we want to always look at the tax levy limit and see where we are in comparison to that. So you can see from this chart, our tax levy is right at our maximum allowable levy. So it's right at the very maximum. There's no dollars available. We're right at the maximum amount we can have. That again results in a tax levy increase of 2.25%. Also, the way legislation is written with our tax levy limit law, as long as our tax levy is either less than or equal to the maximum, we only need a simple majority to have a passed budget. So being equal to allows us to, again, just require a 50% voter approval for this budget.
So I'll jump in here and just talk about next steps as best we know them. We're here this evening on April 2nd, to do our discussion around, first discussion in a workshop kind of form. Later tonight, we're going to release a thought exchange to our entire school community to provide an opportunity for people to share their thoughts and their questions about the proposals we shared tonight, as well as those that we shared back on March 10th. We had at one point in the communications committee thought about running the exchange live during this meeting, and it just seemed like a lot to keep track of remotely. So we're going to launch it this evening, and we're going to keep it open until April 24th because we assume we have more time to adopt the final budget. So our communications office will be launching that link in a little bit. It will have a direct link to the exchange, and we'll have a page on our website where people can go see what is happening on the exchange, and we can use the exchange to guide our Q&A in future board meetings and to put a Q&A on our website, etc. Because we do very much want to hear from our community. The first live opportunity for that, sort of live, is on April 7th, which is Tuesday. We have a regular board meeting. And obviously we can continue with our questions and answers for our school board members and also our community members on the revised budget. From there, we'll continue to respond to questions from the community and others. And I have not spelled out the timelines from here beyond that, because as you may know, a recent governor's executive order moved the May 19th vote to no sooner than June 1st. And we're still awaiting what that date in June might be, and then all of the other benchmark dates we need to meet before that to be in line with all of our statutory requirements for timelines and notice and so on. So more to come on timelines. And lastly, you can always visit our school district webpage for further information. We have a budget and taxes tab with a new drop down that's the 2020-2021 school budget to make this easy for everyone to find. And now it's time for questions. I'm going to stop the sharing so we can see one another. And if I need to go back to the presentation, I'm happy to do that. But let's see if we can do that. Okay. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I just have a question, Marie, on your last bullet about I know we don't know about the voting and timeline. I remember at one point you said that if the social distancing requirement happens for a while, that there's a possibility of if the tax, or if the budget is under the tax cap, it could roll over. Is that still something that you think could happen?
I know there are groups around the state who are advocating for that. I don't know if it has any traction with the governor, because ultimately I think he's going to decide, and we're going to hear through executive order. I know all other municipalities, boards can vote on a budget that's underneath the tax cap, but I just don't know.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Maria, I just have a technical question. I can just see myself, not anybody else. Is there some button I should be pushing?
Up in the corner, you should have an icon that has the number like 14 next to it with a bunch of people. You clicked on that?
Yep. And I just have a bar on my right showing the people that are on the call, but just pictures of them, not the live pictures.
Damien, can you, I'm not as good at this technology as others. Damien, any thoughts on what she can click on?
So Barbara, when you say pictures down the right side.
Yes, it's like a bar from north to south. Andrew Maycock, Benjamin Goes, yourself, Gloria, Judy, but they're just.
None of those faces or people are moving. Do you see me moving?
No.
No.
Barb, did you click on the big picture, like whoever's speaking? Like click on that, then you can see the live.
Let me try that. Well, let's see, I'll try Damien. Yeah, okay, I see him now. Good.
Okay.
Barbara, were you able to see the PowerPoint?
Yes, yep,
Oh.
that was fine. Yep. Before I had about 5 pictures of people live from where they were right now. And right now, as I said, there's just a bar on the right saying who's on the call. And now that I clicked on you, I can see you.
Mhm.
I could see Marie, but I couldn't see my fellow board members. No big
Maybe you
deal.
have to click on
But, I just was wondering if there was something easy that I could hit.
Yeah, I have a question also about the late start times or the change start times, and that
Yep.
you said that the last time you checked that there was a cost savings, but you weren't sure entirely if that's what it's actually true what they're saying. So is that something that, are they still working on that now, or is that paused?
We are, no, actually, as I spoke with Danielle Poirier earlier today, and if there is a silver lining to this chaos that we're living in, is that she and Michael Gannon have had time because they're not driving buses morning and night. So they've been able to go through the route pairings, which is what we got from the consultants, and literally map them through as if they were going to do the run from beginning of the day to the end of the day. And they sent me actually today many, many spreadsheets that I have not been able to look at, highlighting where the potential problems are. And by problems, it's either the bus can't get to the next stop in time, or a new part of the run begins before it ends, or the capacity of the bus is not big enough for the number of students would be on that run. So they've mapped all of that out, and we're going to sit down and look closely at it with school bus consultants. I think our conference call is on Wednesday. And from there, it all comes down to feasibility. And then, you know, is there in fact extra space so we would have a need for fewer routes? And that's really the $64,000 question. So we're going to continue to have that conversation. The other piece, and I'll start this, and Gloria may want to jump in, is that, you know, we've had our committee working we haven't done a ton on engaging the community on this topic because we've been kind of in transportation limbo for a long time. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to put this front and center tonight. Whether or not it materializes into something we can do in the budget for this coming year. But I think I very much want the community to know that this is still very much a live topic and we're continuing to work on it. Gloria, you want to jump in there?
No, I just underscore what you said. I think it's very important that at some point the community is engaged in the conversation so that we have all, constituent members' points of view, because it has been a lot of work that's being done by a group of people, but the opportunity for the entire community to kind of mull this over and talk about the pros and the cons and what's going to happen, I think has to happen. And I'm glad to see that that's in the plan.
Yes.
I have a question. If we save money on not having as many private routes, will we be able to take Danielle and Michael off of being bus drivers?
That would be the hope.
Okay. I mean, that would be one of the things that we would do with that would be to.
Well, they're not bus drivers now, but the reality is on any given day, if we have drivers who call in sick or who are, in some way not able to drive, we still need to get kids to school and home. So it's all hands on deck, and they are certified, licensed operators. So they jump on buses and do what needs to be done. It's not ideal. That's an understatement, because if they're in a bus, they are not available to help problem solve, to lead if something is happening. And it spreads the department very, very thin. I don't know, Neil, if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, it's not a good situation when your supervisors are out driving on a regular basis. A lot of activity happens when buses are on the road. And we do have a lot of buses on the road at one time. So the issues that come in with parent phone calls and coordinating drop-offs and did this child get on the bus? Driver may need help, may break down. We've had that occur as well. And often supervisors respond to those issues. And we had a recent one where no supervisors were available and I ended up going, which is fine, but we would really like to have our frontline supervisors being able to coordinate, direct the work, manage issues, deploy the workforce, problem solve, be creative, and make sure the operation is running well and efficiently. And they can't do that when they're on the road. They can hear things going on, but they can't always respond. So it does stretch the department very thin, and it's certainly not an ideal way to run an organization.
But the savings would be from private transportation routes that we don't have to.
Yeah, we would take those back.
Right.
So right now, we used to have those when we had enough drivers.
Right.
We contracted them out. The goal would be to bring those routes back in and not pay private contractors to do them.
Okay, thank you.
Marie, I had two questions.
Sure.
First, about the routes. If there's any reduction in routes, is it a cost saving, or only if it's the 5 that would be reduced, the maximum of 5?
Well, any number would be a savings. So the draft that we got from the consultants had a possibility of 5. I don't know that we would actually get 5 based on some of the conflicts that have come up. And one of the other pieces that we need to factor in is career and technical education students, because the BOCES, at least at this point, isn't changing the start time for CTE. However, Bethlehem is poised to go to later start time this fall, Niskayuna as well. If we were to move, I think Albany already has, well, Albany does their own CTE. I think if we get a critical mass, we might see a move. Does that answer your question, Rebecca? I'm sorry.
Definitely. And my second one is, you might have said this, But the guidelines for the upper limits of elementary classrooms, is it 25 or 26?
Grades 3 through 5 went from 25 to 26 under this model, and K2 went from 23 to 24.
But what is the actual, the guideline, the national guideline?
There isn't one.
Okay.
Yeah, it's, every school district kind of frames it in a way that will work in their community. So some of our neighboring districts have much higher guidelines, like North Colony right now has very large guidelines because their enrollment has grown faster than the capacity of actual classroom space. Others have lower. We have tended to be on the low end of the spectrum. I looked at an analysis when we were working on this, and in grades I look at our 13 suburban council school district clusters, and you can pull up, it goes back a couple years, the most recent data, but you can pull up and see where do we rank in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. And in every single grade, we were in the top 6 or 7. And often we were in the top 1 or 2 or 3. This would change it a little bit, but you can see it didn't change all that much. That column with the averages was still, really not bad. And, I always say, I do understand that averages don't always capture particular circumstances. So we would have classroom with potentially 26 fifth graders in it. And I get it. That's higher than the classroom in another building that only might have 23. Makes a difference. But yes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Maria, I had another question about the AIS math position at Farnsworth. So is this a change so that the math teacher is not being split from the middle school and high school?
Exactly. So that transition to move the half position from middle to high school, we made that move probably at 10 o'clock the morning of the budget presentation. And, we have very vocal and passionate administrators who took very little time to point out that might have had worse implications than we really understood. So they showed us the data, and they were right. Given the numbers of students and the way the schedule works, a portion of the service for students who struggle in math in the middle school would not have been able to happen, and none of us want that to happen. So this same group of administrators said, but we can offer you Plan B. We don't love Plan B, but at least it doesn't prohibit programming for anybody. And as I said when we started with these recommendations, the goal is to preserve programming. So yes, in other words, we got some good feedback from our leadership team, and we do listen and respond when we can.
Thank you. I was happy to see.
Sure. Other questions?
I have a couple if you can hear me.
Sure.
On the gymnastics cut of the assistant, I think as much as I love gymnastics, that if we're going to have a program, particularly for that program, an assistant really is required. So although I wouldn't like to advocate that we just eliminate the gymnastics team, because I know there are a lot of people that have worked for many, many years, I'm a little bit fearful of not having somebody there to assist on the vault and all the things that those kids do. My other thought, Governor Cuomo has said that he might actually withhold funds mid-year quarterly from the monies that we're getting. So in a sense, although I would hate to make this proposal, but we cut off of some of the stipended positions in Farnsworth for the ski club and the snowboarding. And if we eliminated all stipended positions for clubs, and those that were volunteer would continue, and those that would want to volunteer, in a sense, I think we have to be proactive, because they say we're going to get as much money as we got this year, but I'm very fearful that we're going to be eating into that fund balance like crazy if we don't proactively do something in this year's budget and not wait until next year.
So I don't know if you know this, but every morning for the last 3 weeks, the superintendents from the Cap Region BOCES have had a 9 o'clock conference call with Anita Murphy, who's our district superintendent, who has done a remarkable job keeping her finger on the pulse of these moving parts in Albany. And this morning, she laid out for us what is likely to happen. And it's not as draconian as we have heard about, quarterly cuts in aid in this coming year. In our aid run, we have a new category. Let me see if I can find my aid run. There's a new category called Pandemic Adjustment, in which we were given, in which $195,000 was taken away from us. And then 2 or 3 lines below, there's a restoration called the Federal CARES Restoration. That's the exact same amount, which is what keeps us whole. And what Anita explained to us, that it's probably a portion of that $195,000 that we will see less of over the course of some period of time in the next fiscal year, depending on kind of the financial condition of the state. I know that's convoluted, but I don't think it means that our foundation aid per se will get lopped off in the course of the 2020-2021 school year. I'm not quite sure how all that's going to play out. I do think you're right that 21, 22 is going to remind us all of 9, 10, 10, 11, 11, 12. I think this pandemic adjustment is going to be the new GEA, sadly. Mm-hmm. Regan is on this call. If I can put you on the spot, Regan, I'll give you good practice to talk about the gymnastics reduction.
So, Barbara, did you have a specific question about it? I know,
No, I was just concerned, particularly with that sport, of not having an assistant with the bars and the vaults and all the things those kids do. You really need an assistant. And what I was suggesting, as much as I would hate to do it, if we have to do it, you would just eliminate the sport, even though I know kids have worked at this thing for years and years, and I'd hate to do it, but I'm just a little bit nervous about losing that particular assistant.
Well, it doesn't mean that they won't have an assistant. I think we went through this years ago when that position was cut for a little bit before we reinstated it. And so I've talked to our varsity coach about the potential position elimination. And so we're going to talk about, we didn't know where we were going to land on it. So we will have a conversation about how we can accurately and safely spot and coach in a similar way that we did the last few years since the position's been reinstated.
Oh, okay. So you will have an assistant or volunteer or something that would.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the same thing goes with the 2 lacrosse positions. Just because those positions won't be paid by the district doesn't mean that we won't have them.
Okay.
But we're going to have those conversations with our coaches.
Okay, and the booster clubs.
Correct.
I know it's easier for lacrosse, but gymnastics is such a small program that would be a little bit more difficult to.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Regan.
You're welcome.
He knows that when I saw this proposal, my hands began to sweat immediately.
I have a question about fund balance. Neil, can you tell us about how much fund, you said we're not taking as much. Can you tell us before and after kind of what these projections are, like how much we have now or we will have at the end of the year, and then how much we're going to eat into that?
Well, we're doing that analysis now, and it really changed a lot since schools were shut down. So we have issues now where we're spending more money on certain cleaning supplies and materials along those lines. By the same token, we're not running our buses, we're not heating our buildings as much. So our world is much different than the normal operation of a school district. So John Rizzo, who's our business administrator, he is working on projecting that out over the next several months because we don't know exactly when school is going to resume again. So we're going to do a projection that looks at 1 month of no school and then resuming, or 2 months of no school and then resuming, or maybe we're out until the end of the year, as some states have done as well. So it really depends. We don't have a normal situation going forward. So we're really going to look at those options, and each of those options will yield different results. And that's the exercise we're undertaking right now. So as you can imagine, the stock market's crazy, interest rates are low. There's a lot of factors that changed very quickly recently. We don't have a lot of part-time people working for us. We're substitute teachers now. So it's a much different environment, but we have some increasing costs on the maintenance side and keeping our buildings clean and those sorts of things, having chemicals available and supplies available to do that work. But by the same token, we're not doing a lot of the routine things that we normally do, and we don't have our normal staffing in all situations either, particularly around part-timers and substitutes.
So is that how you got some of the extra money from the fund balance, do you think? I mean, this was
we're really looking at next year in terms of the fund balance. So what we're looking at is some of those reductions, those additional reductions that we put forward will allow us to save from having to use more fund balance. So by having less expenses, we don't need to offset that. We'll actually save on the revenue side. So we won't need to support as much expenditure from savings. So we're trying to hold on to the savings that we have,
right?
Grow that a little bit if possible. We hate to do reductions. We certainly hate to reduce positions and opportunities for students. But by the same token, we have to look at this strategically over the long term. This, as Dr. Weil said, this is likely not the worst of it this year. Next year and the following year could be far worse. So again, it's never good to be in a mode where you're spending more than you take in terms of your revenue, and you have to support it with savings. We don't like to do that anyway, but having less savings certainly puts us in a more tenuous situation going forward. So we're trying to build as much as we can maintain as much as we can in savings, and then have that available should we need it down the road.
And I also would just like to say, I cannot believe that you could get this to come out exactly. I don't know what you did, but I thought that was pretty remarkable.
Well, we want to make sure that we're in a good position, best position we can going forward. Again, this is all about that strategic plan. So we had to make more reductions, obviously, than we wanted to, but it also puts us in a spot where going forward, hopefully we're positioning ourselves as best as possible for a great deal of uncertainty.
But even to me is just unbelievable. Very good. Thank you.
Neil, I have a question for you. This is just a general one. All our bus drivers, cafeteria workers, nurses, teachers, administrators throughout this entire shutdown have been paid, correct?
That's correct.
And only our substitutes, not our permanent subs, but the only where we have actually saved money is in the substitutes that we would call in over the course of the week.
That's correct.
Correct. Okay.
Marie?
Yes.
Do we know if the reductions that are proposed in staffing that you mentioned tonight would be covered by attrition, or how that would play out for the staff?
Some are attrition. That's where we began. Largely the reductions that I presented on March 10th were almost all attrition. Unfortunately, some of the additional ones tonight would put on people on a, a preferred eligible list. They would be, essentially laid off. The good news is we have lots of people out on maternity leaves. So we may be able to bring back some or all in temporary positions, and then see, what the next year brings. But it's just difficult. It's just difficult. And we had very few retirements going into next year. So that made it just a bit of a challenge to do it all through attrition.
Marietta, you are reading can answer. I just had a question about the assistant coach too with gymnastics. How is it decided that that it's gymnastics and not like a bigger sport that has more or bigger booster club or a booster club? Because I thought that there were some things taken away from that team already. I know it's smaller, but doesn't mean that it's less.
There wasn't anything taken away from that team. Private, you're talking about gymnastics, Seema?
Yeah, I thought there was like they had to transport the girls in the gymnastics team. That there was no transportation provided by the district.
No, that's not true. No, we provide transportation for the gymnastics team.
Okay, so the way meets. Okay, I thought that was something that was changed, but like, how is it decided that it's gymnastics and not like another sport? Like, just how does that process work?
Well, I mean, you're looking at assistant coach positions in order to save program. I mean, you're looking at assistant coach positions, and unfortunately, we don't have a ton of assistant coach positions across the district. We don't have any for baseball or softball, basketball. Both girls and boys don't have those, and so what we do have are teams who have a lot of student athletes on the roster: track and field, cross country, football, and so, as Dr. Wiles said, it's like a difficult decision, but you've got a small number of gymnasts. Ideally, we would want an assistant coach there, just like we would for girls and boys lacrosse. But the other assistant coaches that we have across the district all have big roster programs.
Regan, why don't you share the numbers like on our track and field and cross country?
Our track and field rosters, both girls and boys, are generally above 150. Our indoor track and field roster this year was right around that number indoors. The numbers that we had for the first 4 days of the spring track and field season that we're able to get outside and practice, we're right around that number, over 150 per team. Cross country always has big numbers. Our football teams have big numbers. So, in excess of 40 kids on a team.
But some of the sports, not all of the sports, have booster clubs, right? So is that taken into consideration too?
Well, most all of we have individual sport booster clubs. Some school districts have one for the whole program. And so here in Gilliland, we have single sport booster clubs. And it's not ideal to pass that on to the booster club. And we obviously would prefer not to, but when you're looking at being able to preserve the program and looking at ways that we can make some difficult choices on cuts, this is where we landed.
Thanks, Regan.
You're welcome.
Seema, I have another question if you have the time.
Sure, go ahead, Barbara.
For many, many years, we've heard about the German program, and it's lacking in numbers. And as I said, I'm just very much worried about the coming next few years. And was any consideration given to eliminating that program this year? Not eliminating the program, but, you know, beginning in the sixth grade year, you know, so that you build or delete as the years go on? Or do they have a large increase in enrollment and interest this year?
I'll start and then Damien, maybe you want to jump in. A couple years back, we had a dangerously low number of fifth grade students requesting German. So Marcia Ranieri, our instructional administrator for world languages, gathered her faculty, and they have done an extraordinary job of putting together materials to help fifth graders and their families understand what the languages are like. And we have had an uptick in the number of children wanting all four of our languages, including German. So actually this year it didn't even come on the radar because we had a solid number. Damien, I don't know if you want to add to that. I don't recollect the numbers off the top of my head.
I don't have the numbers in front of me right now either, but you pretty much summed it up quite well. I think the numbers were definitely declining. It seems to have stabilized a little bit at a reasonable number with interest at fifth grade. I know Marcia and her team, they've done some kind of rethinking about how to distribute the staffing a bit, but not with the eye on cutting the program at this point.
Well, that's good news.
You know, and Barbara, just from those children would still need to take a language. So it may not be German, but they'd still have to be in a French class or a Spanish class or an Italian class. So it wouldn't really be a savings. It would just be a shifting to a different FTE, a different certification area.
Correct.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, I have a few questions, just really for the rest of the board. Given the changes to the budget that we just saw and given the environment that we live in right now, I just want to get a pulse from the board. Are we, March 10th, there was some slight discussion about maybe going past the tax cap. Are we feeling like that's not a good idea anymore?
I don't think it's a good idea. That's just me. I don't think our community would look on us very well if we did that.
Yeah, I'm not okay with it either. It's just too uncertain to feel comfortable with that.
Well, I would have to go against that as well. So many of our people are out of work and will be out of work, and won't be made whole. They're now talking until the summer, perhaps. So there's no way you can impose an additional tax burden, on our fellow citizens at this point in time. I think we have to do everything we can to tighten our belt and, still give the kids a good education, but I don't see us going over it at all.
I ditto Barbara's comments. Thank you, Barbara.
So that's
I'll add that I agree. I agree.
Like just anecdotally in our office, we've had a huge increase in requests for food assistance, diaper assistance. I mean, it's been exponential. I don't see people supporting an increase in taxes.
Okay, so how do we feel about going right up to that 2.25%, every dollar that we can get, which is where we are right now, based on this proposal?
I think if your aim is to preserve programming to the extent that you can, this is our future. Our kids are our future. So I'm comfortable with getting through this year, but I'm still very nervous about the administration down in Albany because they're not getting any tax money in all these months, and we're not going to get that. So as I said, that's why I was suggesting, maybe even tightening our belt a little bit further if we can, and saving, some of the monies in our reserve fund.
Yeah, I mean, I'm agreeing again with Barb that I don't think it's going to be 1 year. It's going to be several years that we're going to see the impacts from this. So staying under the tax cap definitely, but trying to balance it with keeping the programming and the budget that's presented tonight, I think does a pretty good job of keeping as much, thinking about the students first. You can see that most of the programming has not changed much.
Marie and Neil, from the we had projections on March 10th for future years. Given the cuts that you made this year, if next year and the year after are all tough years like this year, how long can we sustain all of our programming? Like, is that a realistic thought that, like, if there's 2 tough years if next year is another tough year and we want to stay below the tax cap, will we be preserving all of our programs?
A year from now?
Yeah.
No.
I think it's impossible to know that. For one, there are certain variables that are just so uncertain right now. For example, one is, our contributions to our teachers' retirement, employee retirement, teacher retirement systems are dependent on how well they perform in the stock market, which right now is a roller coaster. Once we're beyond this crisis, how quickly the stock market recovers will have a big impact on what that number is for next year. If it recovers quickly and that last year of the 5-year average that they used to set that isn't as horrible as it would be if it were right now, that cost might not go up as much. So, I mean, there's just so many moving parts here. I'm personally not ready to hazard a guess about how long we could maintain everything. I don't know if Neil's braver than I am to hazard a guess.
No, I'm with you. I mean, there's just so much uncertainty at this time, and there's a lot of economic factors that we're riding the wave through right now. Again, when the pandemic finally ends, and who knows when that is, and how quickly the economy recovers, and all of those things are going to determine our future. And right now, we're not even sure what the trajectory is for this particular COVID-19 is. A lot of speculation, but we don't know when it's really going to end and when life may return to normal. And again, how quickly the economy will recover from there. So a lot of unknowns.
Okay. Well, in my mind, if we're assuming that we're not going to break the tax cap, we were already on a path where we would have to cut something at some point, because the projections from March 10th showed 5% increases in the budget, large increases in the budget. And that was before the uncertainty caused by coronavirus. I understand that we're making more cuts now. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if the focus is preserving programs, well, that's great. But if we have to cut them at some point, maybe it's better to be proactive about it. I'm kind of leaning in Barbara's direction of, well, maybe we need to cut more here, and maybe not raise taxes so much, or something like that. And so I was just trying to get the board's feel on, do we want to go right up to the last dollar of allowable tax increases? Again, breaking the tax cap, right? There's no difference between 2.25% and 2.26%. It's just the formula. But if none of us are comfortable going for 2.26%, how much are we comfortable going to? I think this crisis has proven that schools are more than just for instruction, right? We really do serve our communities in a variety of ways, one of which might be this year, we're not going to raise your taxes by 2.25%. I don't know. It's just a thought that I want out there. And if the board is kind of thinking in that same direction, we probably want to give Marie and Neil time to go through and from a more informed perspective, look at what else might be cut instead of, you know, like sometimes happens, us just ad hoc cutting or adding things before we vote on the budget.
Marie, could you amplify that 195,000 or Neil, the $195,000 supposedly in pandemic aid? Is that a direct grant from the federal government, the state government? How are we supposed to get it? And is that in our proposed budget that you just outlined tonight?
Well, it is in there. It's part of the bottom line. But how it's going to work, I think I never heard anything about it till we saw the aid run yesterday. So it's really, my understanding is that when the legislature put the state budget together for education, they cut about 1.5 billion across the board, all school districts. But their goal was to keep school districts whole. So they appropriated 1.5 billion from this federal aid package and gave it back to districts. My understanding is from Anita, whether or not that full $195,000 to fill the hole that we got materializes is in question. I don't know, Neil, if you have more insight than that. You read the big, thick aid package.
No, I don't have any more insight than that either. It's not been widely discussed or enunciated in any particular way. There was no advance notice that that was going to be a line in the state aid runs. So when we got it, it was there, and now it's working our way backwards, trying to figure out exactly what was intended and how that should work under this scenario.
Now, Neil, what is the difference between this year's salaries for all employees and next year's, if everything holds true, you know, with our current contracts? In other words, well, if you don't have the figure right now, that's okay. But for next Tuesday, maybe that would be a good figure to have.
Sure.
Because again, that's the biggest part of our budget. And
Sure.
You know, we faced the same scenario back in 08, 09. And, you know, we're going to be in as big a hole, if not a bigger hole this time around.
Right. And I think, you know, it's a strategic process to work through that. So obviously those are costs that we should be looking at and we'll look at. But I think we also have to put it around a plan, a strategic plan going forward as well. So we need to build all those pieces in.
All right, but will you have that for us for Tuesday? In other words, what the increase in that particular line is from this year, if we stayed as we are whole this year versus next year?
Yes, I can have that.
Great.
And Barbara, do you mean that based on the changes that we presented tonight?
Right. Well, and just be good for the board to know how much in salaries, you know, are projected in this coming year's budget. Now, what's the difference between what we're paying this year and what we're projected to pay for next year?
Okay.
We'll
Marie,
have that.
sorry. Marie, if the thought exchange is open till, you said April 24th?
Yes.
If there are probably going to be changes after that, can we get an updated worksheet like this?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think usually, if you remember, we give you about 6 of those between the time we do the workshop and the time we get the budget done. So we'll update as we go and keep you informed.
Marie, just one more thing that I think we should share with the public. If by some miracle we're able to pull off the start time changes this coming school year, the school that would be starting a little bit later, we will be providing some form of early morning drop off, you know, for parents that have to go to work. early.
Yes, and we have not built that into this spending plan. But in the committee, you'll remember, we talked about having to have some kind of a expanded before school supervision structure. Yes.
Right. You're only talking 20 minutes, half an hour difference, but because that I think would be a point of discussion and concern to people who are used to a particular schedule. And, I think we can ameliorate those fears by, sharing this information.
Sure. Yep. Any other questions, comments? All right. Sina, anything else?
Nope. And nobody else has anything to share? Okay, so just a reminder to fill out your census since you're home. That way we get a community represented, we get the federal funding appropriate. And can I get a motion then to adjourn?
So moved.
Barb, second.
Kelly.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye passes 7-0. Thank you.
Thanks.